In 1429, an uneducated 17-year-old peasant girl appeared before the most powerful military and political rulers in France. She claimed that she had been sent by God to defeat the English who were invading France and to install Charles VII as king. No one took her seriously. Yet, the young woman was not deterred. She went on to achieve everything that she claimed she would do. History would know her as Joan of Arc, and the short, tragic life that she lived is remembered as one of the most remarkable of all time. Joan was born in 1412 into a peasant family in the village of Domremy in northern France. The country at the time was in turmoil. What would become known as the 100 Years' War with England had been going on since 1337. By the time that Joan was a teenager, vast tracts of land in northern France had been claimed by the English. They were intent on putting an English king on the French throne, and it appeared as if the French were powerless to stop them. Yet all of these problems were far from the mind of young Joan, as she toiled on the family farm. The stone house that she grew up in was right next door to the village church, and she developed a strong religious conviction. Her friends would tease her about her piety, yet she would never waver in her moral convictions. Though she never learned to read and write, she was well versed with the teachings of the French church. In 1424, when Joan was 12, her life began to change in a way she could never have imagined. She began to hear voices and to see visions. She later related that she was receiving visions from heaven in the person of Michael the Archangel. The first messages that she received had no political overtones to them. They simply encouraged Joan to continue deepening her religious faith. As time went by, however, the messages became more specific. Joan was informed that she had been chosen to be God's messenger and that he had a great mission for her to perform. She was to be France's rescuer from the English. She would defeat the enemy and then escort France's legitimate ruler, the Dauphin Charles VII, to Reims to be crowned as king. Joan was dumbfounded by these revelations. She could hardly ride a horse, let alone lead an army. Yet her deep faith meant that she never doubted any of the visions. She took all of them seriously. Joan wasn't the only member of the family to receive visions. Her father had one too. He had received a premonition that his daughter was to run away with soldiers. He interpreted it to mean that Joan would elope, and so he made plans for her to marry early. Joan, however, had already secretly made a vow that she would never marry, and she refused to go through with the arrangement. When Joan was 16, she was told in vision that the time had arrived for her to act. She would have much preferred to stay at home and live out the remainder of her life on the farm, but she knew that she could not ignore God's calling. In the vision, she had been given specific instructions to travel to the town of Vaucouleurs and request an audience before Governor Robert de Baudricourt. She was then to ask him to provide her with an armed escort to the castle of Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles lived. Joan told her parents that she wished to visit her cousin, who lived not far from Vaucouleurs, so they let her go. She did visit her cousin, but then persuaded the cousin's husband to take her to Vaucouleurs. Amazingly, she managed to get in front of the governor and explained to him that she had been sent by God to head an army that would drive the English out of France and install the Dauphin as king. The governor reacted as most men in that position would. He told Joan's escort to take the troubled girl home and reprimand her for wasting his time. Not long after a frustrated Joan returned to Domremy, English soldiers attacked the village, burning every structure to the ground. Joan and her family fled to a nearby fortified town. A few months later, the news was received that the English had surrounded the city of Orleans and were about to besiege it. The voices in Joan's head became more insistent. It was God's will that she be the rescuer of Orleans. Joan made her way back to Vaucouleurs and for 6 weeks made repeated attempts for another audience with the governor. During that time, she was not shy about telling the townspeople of her mission. Many of them remembered an ancient prophecy that France would be lost by a woman and then restored by a maiden. They concluded that the woman was the hated Queen Isabeau, who had connived with the English, and that the maiden was Joan. The governor, however, once again refused to take her seriously, yet when she told him that very day the French had lost a battle near Orleans to the English, he told her that if news came through that such a battle had been lost, as she had prophesied, he would give her a letter and send her to the Dauphin. A few days later, word was received that the French had indeed lost a battle to the English just outside of Orleans. The dumbfounded governor finally became a believer. He sent Joan, along with a military escort, on the 350-mile journey to Chinon to see the future king. In preparation for her journey, 17-year-old Joan decided to cut her hair short and dress like a man. The governor himself gave her her first sword. It took 11 days for Joan and her 6 escorts to arrive at Fierbois, a village close to Chinon. There she dictated a letter to the Dauphin, requesting an audience. He agreed, and soon the small party was riding into Chinon. The Dauphin had prepared a test for Joan. The two had never met, and so he placed himself amid hundreds of similarly dressed people. Yet Joan was able to walk up directly to him. She knelt before him and said, "God, give you life, gentle king." But he replied, "I am not the king. There is the king," pointing to another man. Without hesitation, Joan responded, "In God's name, sir, you are the king and no other. Give me the troops, whencewith to succour Orleans, and to guard you to Rheims, to be anointed and crowned. For it is the will of God." Joan also revealed things about Charles that she could not possibly have known. This convinced him that she was indeed sent by God. He gave her a room in the castle tower, along with the household staff, a knight, and a chaplain. However, some members of the royal court were highly suspicious of the young maiden. Precious weeks were wasted, as Joan's background was thoroughly investigated. Finally, she was given a military retinue that consisted of a steward, 2 pages, 2 heralds, messengers, and all the equipment she would need to lead an army. A special suit of armor was fashioned for her, and the Dauphin gifted her a horse. The rough and ready men of the Dauphin's army didn't know what to make of their new commander. Joan told them that this was now God's army, and they must act accordingly. There was to be no swearing, and each man must confess his sins. She also forbade them from looting villages or burning homes. Joan personally chased immoral women from out of the army camp. Before marching her army to Orleans, Joan dictated a letter that was sent to the English commanders. The letter demanded that they surrender to the maid who was sent from God, the King of Heaven, the key to all of the good cities that you have taken and violated in France. She is entirely ready to make peace if you are willing to settle accounts with her, provided that you give up France and pay for having occupied her. The English responded that if this young upstart dared to engage with them, she would be caught and burnt at the stake. After a 3-day march, Joan's army arrived at Orleans. The English had set up their siege along the banks of the Loire River. Joan now met Jean d'Orléans, the Count of Dunois, who commanded the Orleans army. Believing he had better battle tactics than the teenage girl, he sent Joan and her army on a long detour that would purposefully keep them out of the coming battle. When Joan realized that she had been duped, she rode up to d'Orléans in a rage, declaring, "In God's name, the counsel of our Lord God is wiser and safer than yours. You thought that you could fool me, and instead, you fooled yourself. I bring you better help than ever came to you from any soldier to any city. It is the help of the King of Heaven." Joan rode into the besieged city of Orleans on April 29, 1429. Her reputation meant that crowds treated her with awe, and she spent the next 9 days preparing for the battle. As it turned out, Jean d'Orléans again deceived her, leading his army against English reinforcements while Joan was sleeping. When she learned of the encounter, she quickly put on her armor and rode to the battle. The sight of her infused the French troops with energy, and they surged forward to victory. But the main battle was not yet won. 2 days later, Joan led her army across the Loire River and directly into the mass of the English army. A brutal battle ensued, with the English being finally overwhelmed. The majority were either killed or captured. Joan's victory at Orleans was stunning. Still, the Dauphin and his councillors procrastinated about the next move. Yet, Joan was not willing to wait on them. She prepared to attack the fortress at Les Tourelles. Before the battle, Joan prophesied that she would be wounded in the left breast, but not fatally, and that her army would be victorious. That is exactly what happened. The victory at Les Tourelles was so great that it is still celebrated by the French every May the 7th. Joan had now fulfilled the first part of her mission, the relieving of Orleans. Next came the crowning of the Dauphin as king. She now met up with Charles and urged him to go with her to Reims to be crowned. But once again, the Dauphin's councillors demurred. After 2 weeks, Charles was convinced and the army was sent out to clear the towns for his unimpeded passage to Reims. They first captured the city of Jargeau, which was where the English survivors of the Battle of Orleans had fled. Inspired by their teenage commander, who was fearless, the French once again routed their enemy. By now, Joan's reputation as a conqueror meant that towns under English control simply opened the gates and allowed her army to march in without putting up a fight. Charles VII was crowned King of France at Reims on July 17, 1429. Joan's parents made the long journey to witness the unbelievable triumph of their daughter firsthand. The English, however, were not yet defeated, and Joan still had work to do. On September the 8th, she led her army against the English-occupied Paris. Joan was struck in the thigh with an arrow before they could even cross the moat that surrounded the city, and her army withdrew. The next day, news was received that King Charles, timid as always, had called off the attack. There was little action for the next few months. Then, in May 1430, Joan travelled to Compiègne with 400 men to help defend it against the English. They were overwhelmed by more than 6,000 of the enemy. Joan and her men were forced to retreat. In the scramble to get away, Joan was taken prisoner by the English. The English rejoiced at having captured the Maid of Orleans. She was taken to Rouen, the seat of the English occupation government in France, where she was held in a dungeon, in chains, to await a trial on the charges of heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft. Joan's trial began on January the 9th, 1431, and lasted for 5 months. The verdict was never in doubt. She was found guilty on all charges. Her life, however, would be spared if she promised to no longer wear men's clothing and to stop claiming to have received visions from God. She did neither and was condemned to be burned at the stake. According to a witness, Joan praised God at the stake, even as flames were devouring her. Her last word was Jesus. Joan's remains were dug from the ash heap and thrown into the Seine River. So ended the short, remarkable life of Joan of Arc, the Maiden of Orleans and saviour of the French people. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe. If you have any other suggestions for future topics you'd like us to cover, please leave a comment below. And we'll see you next time on History Junkie.